So Sara, who's up here next, I love that you get to call yourself a social, ecological system scientist, which is what we all should have as titles, right? I mean, that's like encompassing all of that. So looking at this from a systems perspective allows us to look into research on all those different levels. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say and how that fits in the puzzle. Thanks.
So I am Sara Meerow. I'm an assistant professor here at ASU in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning. And today I'm going to talk about urban resilience and green infrastructure planning. So cities around the world, from Phoenix here to Detroit, are undergoing rapid social, environmental, and demographic changes, while at the same time grappling with a wide array of risks and hazards. Everything from climate change to natural disasters to economic crises. And so at its core, I think urban resilience is about the capacity of cities to both withstand these kind of shocks as well as adapt to slower changes that they experience. And so in my work, I'm really focused on trying to understand what urban resilience means and how we can make our cities more resilient to climate change and other hazards, at the same time as making them more sustainable and just. So, a small task. But so why all this fuss about resilience? Well, if we have more ecologists here, it's perhaps not as difficult to convince you, because I think the idea of resilience has really resonated with ecologists for some time now. But we've seen that in recent years, there's been a rapid rise in the number of academic publications specifically on urban resilience or resilient cities, as well as a proliferation of kind of high-profile policy initiatives like the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program, which are designed to supposedly make our cities more resilient. But despite the growing popularity of this idea of urban resilience, it remains a fuzzy concept. It's difficult to operationalize as well as to measure. And so this is really one of the sort of prominent criticisms that we've seen emerging in recent years towards this proliferation of this resilience agenda in our cities. And there is concern that it's becoming sort of meaningless jargon or just a buzzword. There's another kind of common criticism is the fact that resilience efforts and scholarship has perhaps not paid sufficient attention to the kind of contested politics of resilience building in our cities, as well as potential trade-offs that emerge as we try to implement resilience strategies. So with my colleagues, I've spent some time really kind of digging into this emerging urban resilience literature. And what we found is that while the field has largely drawn from the field of ecology, so work of folks like Halling and Folke, it has really also drawn from other disciplines, and as a result, we see a number of different, somewhat contested or inconsistent definitions of urban resilience. And in fact, we identified these 6 different theoretical tensions within these different definitions that we see in academic literature on urban resilience. And so these findings actually led us then to add to the number of definitions and try to craft, though, our own definition, which you see here, where we really carefully worded it, though, to try to take a position on each of those 6 conceptual tensions. And so, for example, there is this tension between so-called engineering resilience, which is really about sort of bouncing back or returning to a prior state, versus a more ecological or evolutionary idea of resilience, which is that, you know what, systems are complex, they're constantly adapting, and as a result, it's going to be impossible to, and actually potentially undesirable, to just bounce back to that prior state. And so instead, we want to focus on maintaining key functions while still actually adapting and transforming parts of it. And so that's something that we incorporate into our definition, is the fact that we see resilience as more of this kind of bouncing forward or ecological evolutionary concept. We also found that in the urban resilience literature, the urban was actually not very clearly defined. And so we developed this conceptual schematic of the urban system to try to think through what would be the various components that you would need to consider as you tried to sort of develop a more holistic urban resilience assessment or policy. And so this includes things like the governance networks, the networked material and energy flows, the urban infrastructure, including green infrastructure, which I'll talk more about in a minute, and also socioeconomic dynamics. And so we hope that this conceptual schematic could potentially sort of serve as a little bit of a heuristic for thinking through what the urban actually means and what needs to be considered. Now, when it comes to actually applying resilience or measuring it, urban resilience is proven to be quite challenging. And so what we mainly see is there's a number of different characteristics, both of urban kind of more technical or physical systems, as well as characteristics of how we actually manage our urban systems, which are supposed to increase resilience. And many of these will, I think, look familiar to you as some of those characteristics or qualities that we had on our cards earlier. I noticed that just in talking to some people around me, that things like diversity, self-organization, which is what I had in my name tag, are concepts that you see or characteristics that you see coming up in the urban resilience literature that are supposed to enhance resilience. My only, I guess, qualification of that is that I think there has been somewhat limited testing of these characteristics for urban systems themselves and actually validating whether we can apply these kind of ecological principles to our cities. And just on the left there, you can see that's a graph which shows, we actually asked in a survey US local government officials to rate the importance of different these 16 kind of commonly cited characteristics from the academic literature to see how important they felt they were for enhancing climate resilience in their communities. And what we see is that overall they felt that they were important. They generally rated them all as quite important, above sort of 3, which was, I think, somewhat important. But there is some variation in terms of those, and those are not necessarily the same characteristics that they rated as most important, were not necessarily the ones that we see most often in the academic literature. So there does seem to be a little bit of a policy sort of theory-practice divide on this idea of urban resilience. And so finally, to try to address this critique that I mentioned about the lack of attention to the politics or trade-offs within resilience, we also presented this or developed these 5 questions, what we call the 5 W's of urban resilience, which just says that when you're actually applying resilience in a city, you need to think through questions of resilience for whom, what, when, where, and why, and be really upfront and transparent about this. So now shifting focus to green infrastructure, I wanted to briefly talk about some work that I've done on this. So I think we're all aware that in recent years we've seen this growing focus on expanding green infrastructure as a strategy to enhance resilience in cities. And while it's generally promoted on the basis that it's going to provide multiple ecosystem services, and I would agree with Janine's presentation earlier that our ultimate goal would be to have multifunctional green infrastructure everywhere in our cities. I think we're not quite there yet. And what I found is that in practice, cities in the US at least tend to be very focused on stormwater when they're thinking about planning green infrastructure, despite making the case for it based on this multifunctionality. And also cities have limited resources. And so they have to make tough decisions about where to actually site green infrastructure. And so in one study, we looked at the city of Detroit, which, as you're all aware, probably faces a number of resilience challenges, large areas of vacant land, which are problematic in some ways, but actually do potentially present an opportunity to expand green infrastructure and to sort of reimagine the urban form, potentially in this in a more generous way. And in fact, the city has embarked on a fairly ambitious green infrastructure program. So the city's water utility plans to implement green infrastructure, and has been implementing projects, as you can see in this map, focused on reducing CSO overflows in the city. But what's not clear, and so when they make the case, again, for this green infrastructure approach instead of a more traditional gray or engineered infrastructure, they do so that it's going to provide multiple community benefits. But when it actually comes to citing them, it's not clear that they're integrating those. And so we developed this green infrastructure spatial planning model as a way to actually examine to what extent they were making these siting decisions based on kind of multiple benefits, and whether essentially they were placing green infrastructure in potential hotspots for multifunctionality, or where ecosystem services are really needed, and also as a potential decision-making tool for identifying which neighborhoods would be high priority for future green infrastructure. So it's essentially a spatial multi-criteria evaluation, integrates a number of 6 different benefit criteria, which are everything from managing stormwater, reducing social vulnerability, increasing access to green space, reducing the urban heat island impact, improving air quality, and increasing landscape connectivity. And so we mapped out where, for each of these benefit criteria, which neighborhoods would be highest priority in the city. We compared sort of synergy and trade-off patterns between that. So for example, you see synergies, interestingly, between the stormwater, urban heat island, and air quality criteria. So we see that as somewhat promising, but potential trade-offs between sort of landscape connectivity and stormwater. And then we actually asked stakeholders in the city to tell us what their priorities were for planning green infrastructure. And we're actually able to turn those into weights and create more contextually relevant hotspots for green infrastructure planning in the city. And finally, able to compare those modeled hotspots to the actual locations of green infrastructure projects. And I can say that they were not correlated. So essentially, it seems that this is a missed opportunity for the city to really leverage the multiple benefits of green infrastructure, even with limited resources. And yeah, I think I'm out of time, so that's it.
Thank you, Sarah. So I 2 great pieces out of that, like the story of what it means to even be a resilient city, also makes me think of, well, okay, how are we going to define a generous city? And how do we work that piece going forward? And then the opportunities to unpack just slices of these ecosystem services. Resilience is really an ecosystem service as well. And what does that look like and model and plan for it?